anyways, in all this decision, we can all this decision we can treat through the prism of let's say human factor, and as long as this human factor exists, there'll be some difficulties in making sharp decisions. So when human cannot decide something, we try to understand what about this thinking the artificial intelligence. So what we asked him how to change the security architecture on our planet. At what we have very interesting answers. So I will quote some of them. One, for example, he says about the conflict resolution mechanisms. So I'm quoting: an effective security architecture should prioritize peaceful conflict resolution mechanisms such as mediation, negotiation, and diplomacy. This can help prevent conflicts from escalating and promote stability among nations. You know, it sounds to me like I'm talking to the representatives of the United Nations, actually. So the same I would say in the GPT chat. So all this mediation, negotiations, and diplomacy we saw that's made Putin, the head of the state aggressor, much more powerful at the beginning of the full-scale aggression and entry in the Ukraine. So maybe these people, like such people like Putin, understands just the word of power, or you still will agree with GPT chat that's mediation, negotiation, and diplomacy. This is all the instruments we have right now.
Well, I think what you have provided as example of what I tell my students, that using artificial intelligence is often not the right way to produce a persuasive argument. And the problem with what it has produced is that it's completely inapplicable to the situation that we find ourselves in relation to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is that Russia has shown by its behavior over many years that what it finds unacceptable is a Ukraine that is functionally independent. So it's worth mentioning, and I try to mention this to people who are not following the situation as closely as I am, that the invasion of Ukraine, which, as you said, began in 2014 with the occupation of Crimea and the aggression against eastern Ukraine, the stimulus for that had nothing to do with, say, NATO, right? It had to do with the wish of most people in Ukraine to pursue a cooperation with the European Union, which the government of the Russian Federation and the person of Vladimir Putin said was unacceptable, that Ukraine could not pursue that kind of relationship with the EU, which most of its citizens wanted and still want. And I mention this because I think what it shows is the maximalism of Russia's position on Ukraine, that Ukraine is not really an independent state. It cannot do the things that independent governments think they can do, right? That they can do as a matter of international law and that they should be able to do in practice, that go with being a sovereign state, such as negotiating preferential trade agreements, other forms of cooperation, that in this case really didn't have any military component. And what I think that speaks to in the context of the blurb that the AI system produced for you is that it's very hard to see mediations succeeding in this context. Russia has articulated or has made clear that it has a series of positions on Ukraine that involve either destroying Ukraine altogether as a state, or at least seizing a lot of Ukrainian territory and turning the rest of Ukraine into essentially a satellite, like the satellite states of Eastern Europe during the Cold War period before 1989. And the people of Ukraine rightly see that as outrageous and unacceptable and a violation of their state's, their right to chart their own destiny in the world and to have a state that is, according to the principles of the United Nations, an independent and equal member of the community of nations. And that is why the sort of calls for negotiation that we see, not only from chatbots, but also from some misguided individual human beings, are really missing the point, or at least perhaps you could even say just ignoring the evidence that Russia is not amenable to this kind of negotiation right now. I think I would add, if I may, that this is also why, and perhaps in connection with the points we've been discussing earlier about the failure of the UN to restrain to restrain Russia, that why it's starting to seem to many people, including to me, that the only way to prevent Russia from continuing its now nearly a decade-long course of aggression against Ukraine is to invite Ukraine to join NATO. So I think what we've now seen in the roughly 30 years since the Soviet Union disbanded and 15 independent states emerged on its territory is that Russia does not accept the independence of its neighbors, and in any meaningful sense. It's shown that not only in relation to Ukraine, but also in relation to Georgia, a significant portion of whose territory it occupies, to Moldova, which it has dismembered, to Belarus, which it has turned into a virtual satellite. I think the guiding principle of a lot of post-Cold War diplomacy involving Europe and the United States and Russia was that somehow these states could exist independently, but not within NATO. And whatever the justification was for thinking that in the past, I'm afraid that Russia's behavior indicates very clearly that it won't accept their independence in any meaningful way. And to my mind, that suggests that those like Ukraine now and possibly others in the future that wish to join NATO should be strongly considered, and that Russia should not be able to exercise a veto. In the case of Ukraine, to me, this seems like the only way that Russia can be shown that its aggression against Ukraine is not going to produce the results that it wants, and moreover, that it could have very serious negative consequences for Russia. So I hope that the upcoming Vilnius summit of NATO will result in a path forward for Ukraine to join NATO. And I would add that, again, given where the world is with the United Nations, right, if the UN were capable of defending Ukraine effectively against Russian invasion, it might be a different conversation, but we are where we are. The UN has shown that it is not capable of doing that, or at least is not willing to do it. There is no reason within international law for NATO to decline to consider Ukraine's membership application simply on the basis of Russia's objections. And this is the way that we, as an Atlantic community, can pursue international peace and stability in Europe, both for Ukraine's sake and for the sake of all of us. Yeah.